It's always a great pleasure to put the microphone up here and welcome this lovely lady to my dining room table. Frances Nelson, KC. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Could I get you to come a little bit closer to the microphone? It's very directional. Yeah, that's fair. You've been well?
Yes, I have. Haven't got time to be sick.
No, that's right. You've chalked up 40 years doing probably the hardest job in law, chairing the Parole Board. 40 years?
Yes, I know. I really think I've been in the system longer than the average murderer. And with little prospect of early release.
Yeah. Well, speaking of early release, this fellow that was one of the Snowtown people involved in, I don't know whether he admitted to being involved in any of the killings or just watching. I can't remember the details of the story.
No, he helped to dispose of some of the evidence after the event.
Yeah.
So he was never convicted of murder. He was charged with assisting an offender, to which he pleaded guilty.
And that was how many years ago? How many years has he been inside?
25 years.
25 years.
That was the sentence, the head sentence that the judge imposed. So he will be at the end of his sentence in May this year, and he'll be released.
Now, there's going to be some controversy surrounding that. People aren't going to like that. But then again, is there anything the state can do to stop it?
No, nothing.
How do you make sure he's okay, safe to be put out on the street?
We've actually resolved to release him on parole a couple of months early, because that way he'll have some level of supervision before his head sentence finishes. And we've interviewed him several times, so we've monitored his progress for the last nearly 8 years. And we don't feel that he is a danger to the community.
We see and hear a lot about people on bail or on parole reoffending. And the first thing your mind goes to is, well, you know, he shouldn't have been out, or she shouldn't have been out, or...
We do actually have the lowest recidivism rate in Australia here, in our state. And obviously you can't always get it right. But I think that we have a fairly good approach. Yeah. And we're perhaps a little more conservative than some other states in terms of releases, but sometimes things go wrong. You'd be people do reoffend.
Yeah, but you'd be a very good judge of character, because you'd have had lots of people in front of you who are possibly quite skilled at pulling the wool over your eyes, or trying to, or just plain lying. But you would develop over 40 years an uncanny ability to spot these things.
I think with experience you do become better at assessing people. And of course they all come in and say what they think you want to hear.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're sincere or genuine. And there are people who are quite manipulative, who are quite slick and articulate, and who have persuaded a whole lot of other people that they're safe. And quite often we have a very different view of that. You know, fortunately we have two very senior psychiatrists who also sit on the board, and they have a lot of experience with people who have antisocial personality disorders. And I think that's been very helpful. And I've certainly learnt a lot from those people. And I suppose I've developed a fair level of cynicism too, because the script doesn't vary a lot, Jeremy. They're not frightfully inventive.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they will all say, I really need to be out. I've done enough jail and I have to be there for my children. Yeah. They've been offending probably for 30 years and their children are in their 30s, you know. So they haven't given them a thought for 30 years. Yeah. I'm not sure that we take that very seriously in terms of it being a protective factor. It may be well meant, but past behaviour does to some extent indicate future behaviour. And the other one is I have to look after my elderly mother who's in poor health. And Mum's been in poor health for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Hasn't stopped them offending.
No.
Or I've got a new lady, I've got a new relationship and it's all wonderful. The relationship's been in existence for about 6 weeks, so you do have a big question mark.
Yeah.
So those are the main ones.
I've heard these fantastic stories about women who fall in love with men in jail. I've often wondered how it happens, why it happens. I mean, a woman outside is, intrigued by a man that she's maybe never going to see? Well, perhaps that's the attraction.
I find it curious because very often there's serious violent offenders, and I wonder what the attraction is.
What do you make of that?
I've never been able to work that out, Jeremy. I suppose all I can think is it adds a frisson of excitement to their lives. To have some sort of relationship at arm's length with someone who's committed a horrible murder or a violent crime.
There was a funny country song I remember. I think Johnny Cash sang it. Ladies love outlaws like bankers love gold. I don't know.
Well, certainly there's an attraction, and often they're highly intelligent women.
Mm.
So I can only think there's something missing in their lives. But I have seen it many times.
Yeah. Yeah. The fascinating thing, looking back on all of the cases, I don't know if you keep a record of them or you keep track of them. I mean, how many times have you sat there? How often do you meet with this board?
I have a meeting every Tuesday.
And how many cases would you do every week?
We'd probably have 13 or 14 interviews, but we'd have probably 20 other items on the agenda.
Sounds like a full-time job.
It feels like it at times because I get constant email requests outside of a meeting, and that includes weekends. I get files every day to deal with because I have to do reports to the Attorney General. I have to respond to ministerial requests. I have to do reports for the court.
Because if you get it wrong, they get the heat, I suppose, in the court of public
then
opinion.
They can blame us.
Have they done that?
No. And I think it would be unfortunate if they did. I think it's probably wise for a politician to remain at arm's length because then it can be somebody else's fault.
Yeah, but you look back on them, have there been great successes and great failures, or is it all just a sea of people you'd rather forget?
No, we have had some singular successes, and they're the ones the public never hear about.
No, they wouldn't. Papers don't like, media doesn't like good news.
Apparently. But there have been huge changes in my time. When I was persuaded to do this, and I can promise you the Chief Secretary lied at the time, he said, it's just a meeting, it's about an hour once a month. And my first meeting was in the Norwood Community Corrections Office. The prisoners were lined up in the passage, handcuffed. Yeah. We had a room out the back with a fan. It was a very hot November day. And in order to have a cup of tea, we had to unplug the fan to plug in the kettle. And the files were delivered to me in big plastic tubs like butchers use.
Oh, yeah.
And they were enormously heavy, so I had to lug them home, read them, and then lug them to the meeting.
Large-sized Tupperware.
And I think we met till about 8 o'clock that night, and I thought, this is going to be a very short tenure if things don't change markedly, because there was no meeting place for the board. There was no real security.
Is there now?
Yes. When Frank Blevins took over the portfolio, and he held it even when he was Deputy Premier for 9 years, I think, he bought a building in Flinders Street in 1993.
Right.
And we have a proper meeting place. We have cells out the back. We have an area for the secretariat. But that was the most extraordinary meeting I've ever been to in my life. In fact, if I'd had a video, I think I could have made money out of it. It was a comedy of errors.
Well, you could still do a podcast. You could turn the whole thing into a...
Yes, so things have changed significantly. And I think our processes have become more professional. It was all very shambolic, is the only word. The files were not what I would have expected in terms of the information you needed to have.
Yeah.
It was all bits and pieces of something that someone thought was a good idea. So there was no system. We had no forms. We had no processes or protocols.
Yeah.
And fortunately, the then Chief Executive of Corrections let me have his secretary as my secretary, and for 6 months we just tried to develop a process, develop some forms, develop some protocols and communication models. But those first 6 months were very, very difficult.
Is there any limit to the number of times somebody can come back and ask for parole?
Yes, there is. If we reject someone, we can say, don't apply for another 12 months.
Because I know, I can't think of his name, Sirhan, the guy who assassinated Robert Kennedy.
Yes.
He keeps coming up for parole like they're going to let him out. They don't even... They must give him some sort of encouragement and come back next week or something.
I don't know how frequently he applies, but I know here, under the legislation, we can say they're not to apply for 12 months.
You seem to me to be a very calm person. But, you know, if you're going in to ask for parole, you're going in to ask for your freedom, you know, clammy hands and everything depends on this. I've got to get this right. And you just happen to be in a bad mood. You know, you picked the wrong day to ask you for parole. You don't get into moods.
I understand people are anxious. I can deal with that.
Yeah.
And you can allow them to talk and let their anxiety level reduce, and then you can ask some harder questions. The ones that really, really annoy me are the ones who tell bad, stupid lies or who come in with a sense of entitlement that's misplaced. And even if I'm not in a bad mood to start with, that can make me feel fairly irritated.
Would a woman get parole more easily than a man?
No. No, we're not gender biased.
No, but you know.
And we're not very much taken in by tears.
I'll remember that.
Well, there are some people who appear before us frequently that we know are going to have crocodile tears. Yeah. It really doesn't cut any ice with me.
No, it was
if they're genuine, that's a different thing.
There was a story here that I didn't get to read entirely, but it was a very interesting story on sociopaths. And the idea was, the story headed off, is your neighbour a sociopath? And apparently it went on to explain, yes, probably.
We're not allowed to use that word anymore.
Oh, why?
They're now described... Oh, I don't know. They change the language from time to time.
Oh, don't they?
They're now described as antisocial personality disorders.
Oh, I see, right.
But
you could get an NDIS package for that.
Sure. You can get an NDIS package for practically anything.
I get that.
In fact, we now have some former prisoners who are providers.
Yes. Well, that wouldn't surprise me.
Providing services for NDIS.
Well, Bill Shorten did say that the NDIS was in the hands of organised crime, which is very honest.
I do think that the NDIS system is often abused. And it troubles me when you see a prisoner who is getting support 6 hours a day. And, there's nothing to indicate the prisoner's disabled in that sense.
No.
They may have a mild intellectual disability or something which really shouldn't prevent them living independently.
Why not just tell him to go and buy a Jack Russell?
Yes, well, they can't discipline themselves. They'd have trouble with a dog, I think.
Yeah.
But we often say, well, what do these people do for you? Oh, they take me shopping. But can't you shop for yourself? Of course I can.
Yeah.
They take me to the doctor. Well, can't you get to the doctor yourself?
Well, it's sort of over-servicing, isn't it? It's the new age of over-servicing.
It's worse than that. It reduces any independence.
Yes.
And that's a bad thing.
Yes.
Because, when people lose their independence, they lose an ability to make decisions. But, of course, someone's making a lot of money out of it.
Well, of the 170,000 providers for various services through the NDIS, there are only 17 who are registered, authorised.
That doesn't surprise me.
And Bill Shorten just quite calmly announces this as if he had no responsibility for, hey, you just don't get to provide the service unless you're registered, and therefore we can check you out.
Well, everyone else has to have a licence to do something. And
yeah.
Where we have difficulty in parole, if someone's got NDIS carers, is that they're in a conflict because the person who employs the NDIS carer is making money out of that prisoner.
Yes, yes.
And they're reluctant to report any transgressions because the prisoner might go back into custody and then they'd lose the income.
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to see that quite frequently, unfortunately.
But when you see it, I imagine the authorities or the people who run the NDIS see it. Do they attempt to do anything about it, to rectify the problem?
We haven't had any success in that direction so far.
Would you like to run it? Just on your just spare time.
Just in my spare time. I think you'd have to start again, Jeremy. I really do.
It was worked out on the back of an envelope anyway, so I'm not surprised it has flaws.
I think the intent is good.
Oh, yes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah.
But it needs to be properly regulated because it's incredibly expensive.
Yes.
And I'm sure we are paying people just to sit around and watch Netflix.
Yeah, look, I have
while parolee smokes dope.
Yep, I have got no doubt. And the other sad thing is that you pick any of the services that are being provided, and the individual, or you or I, can get that same service for 7 times less the cost than they hit the NDIS with. And the NDIS is obviously not street smart enough to see that or to check prices or to bargain them down or something. It's very frustrating.
It's just being abused, and I think that sooner or later there'll be a crisis and someone will have to do something about it. But like everything else, if you wait for the crisis, by then it's galloped out of control. Surely someone could sit down and say, now we have to have a process of approval, accreditation, and set some sensible management principles in place.
With the occasional audit to make sure that everything is kosher.
Well, that would be handy because I've seen some recovery notices in personal injury cases from NDIS where someone's achieved an award of damages, and then NDIS quite properly says, well, look, we've supplied all this to date and we want to recoup that out of the damages. But quite often you can't even make any sense of the schedules that they produce. And there's no underlying documentation to enable you to evaluate whether they were reasonably provided and properly costed.
And probably no follow-through to make sure that even if they are supposed to give the money back, maybe they don't give the money back.
Well, I think that a lot of the recovery notices are likely to be disputed.
Yeah.
And again, that probably means that it will be adverse for NDIS because they may not recover what they should properly recover.
Yes.
So the whole processes need to be reorganised.
Yes. The alarm bells should have started ringing when they realised with the disability support pension, when it was supposed to be, I think they thought it would be 20,000 people or something like that, or they had a budget of 20 billion, and it just grows exponentially.
I see perfectly healthy 25-year-old male prisoners who are going to go back on the disability pension.
Yes.
And I say to them, what is your disability? And I'll get an answer like, I've got anxiety.
Haven't we all?
That's my response usually. And I do not approve of those people being labelled disabled because they're not.
No.
I think it's a terrible thing to do to someone.
And a disservice to people who are, in fact,
exactly,
disabled.
Because you're taking the resources away from the genuinely disabled. It also means there's no incentive for someone to get a job.
No.
Where if they can get employment, it improves their self-esteem. So I rather think I am notorious for the fact that I expect people to work.
God bless you.
And often I'll get prisoners who come in and the first thing they say is, I've got a job if I'm released. I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, that's a damn good thing. Yeah.
And certainly David Brown, who's the current Chief Executive of Corrections, has put a lot of focus on vocational training.
Yeah.
So people in prison learn some proper work skills.
Something useful.
Therefore, they've got a better chance of getting a job.
Yeah.
If they get a job, the chances of them staying out of trouble are increased.
Yeah.
And he's done a great job there, I think. So instead of just sitting around trying to smuggle Suboxone into their cell, they're actually out working in the industries section or on the farm or in the factory or in the carpentry shop, whatever.
Yeah, there was a story we looked at a few weeks ago. Jeff Kennett suggested that we go back to, for juvenile offenders, we go back to the business of a prison farm, not a jail. They're out there learning a skill, tiring themselves out, getting exercise, and not being influenced by other more senior prisoners, more experienced prisoners. What do you think of the idea of... I think we still have prison farms, but not for junior or for...
No, only for adult offenders.
Yeah.
There's a farm at Port Lincoln and there is one at Cadell. But I'm not aware that there's one in the juvenile institution.
No, well, that was his idea. I don't know the merits of it.
I think if people learn work skills, all the international research indicates they are less likely to reoffend.
Oh, yes, I would think so.
They've got a reason to get out of bed other than to go and find their local drug dealer.
Yeah. So a lot of controversy about when a child who offends should be treated as an adult. Well, what is the age? I know people want...
It's currently 10.
10.
And people want to raise it to 14.
What do you think?
Well, I've dealt with 2 murderers, one of whom was 12 and the other was 13. Now, how are you going to deal with them if they're deemed not to be criminally responsible? You can hardly send them off to a family conference.
No. But how does that make you feel?
Well,
doesn't it sort of shatter your faith in human nature that you could have somebody of that age able to, willing to kill?
One of them was very influenced by those violent videos.
Oh, yes.
And he did say to me, well, I think I asked him and he agreed, that at times he had trouble separating fantasy from reality. So I think you have to look at what we're doing as a society with young people. Yeah. I mean, what sort of society produces violent 12-year-olds?
But still you're obliged to, to punish him? to understand why he is the way he is? How do you handle it?
Well, of course, when they're 18, they come into the adult system, so we don't deal with them before that time. But you've got to go back and try and understand why they did what they did and whether those factors have been dealt with.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult with young offenders. If they're not dealt with in that sense in the juvenile system, they come into the adult system as a young adult and they spend their young adult years in jail. So the environmental factors don't impact on them as they would in the community. And it's very hard to change a pattern of behaviour when someone's over 28, I think.
And those two went to jail or into...
They went into a juvenile institution and then they were moved to prison once they turned 18.
And how long a sentence will they get?
I can't remember the sentence. They both got non-parole periods, and I can't tell you offhand. But we see people who've been committing violent crimes since they were 8 or 9. And certainly quite a few who commit violent robberies at the age of 12.
Any common denominator that leads you to believe that there is a particular or common problem?
Family background.
Yeah.
You know, they're in dysfunctional families. No one cares where they are at night. The family's probably marred by domestic violence, sexual abuse, drugs and alcohol. Often single-parent families with multiple men in their lives.
Yeah.
They don't go to school regularly. So they learn survival skills. They don't learn social skills.
Interesting, yeah.
It's a big socio-economic problem, and governments don't like to deal with it because it's a big problem. But the idea that the system, once they've developed that pattern of behaviour, is miraculously, in a short period of time, going to change things isn't going to be helpful. You know, if you don't tackle the causes of crime, it doesn't matter how long you lock people up.
Everything is cause and effect, after all. Yeah. How much does it cost to keep a prisoner in jail?
About $100,000 a year.
Yeah, that's quite a punishment for society, isn't it? I mean, $100,000 a year to put somebody away.
It is.
And with no guarantee that you're going to get any value for money at the end of it.
Well, the only value the community could expect to get is twofold. Firstly, it takes a dangerous person out of circulation.
Yeah.
Secondly, you would like to think, as a community member, they would come out better than when they were admitted to prison.
But when you think that, say, $100,000 a year, somebody goes away for 10 years, that's $1 million that the taxpayer, society has to pay for the privilege of just getting somebody off the streets. Do you or have you ever believed in the death penalty?
No, I'm uncomfortable with the concept of judicial murder.
Yeah.
I think it's terrible for the person who has to inflict it.
Yeah.
And one of the first cases I ever had was when I was an article clerk, and I wasn't articled to this particular solicitor who acted for the last man hanged.
Yeah.
But for some reason I was sent down to the Adelaide jail to take a statement from him for his petition for mercy. And I would have been, 19. And it really impacted on me that I was talking to someone who was going to be killed in the short term.
Yeah. And there's no evidence, I wouldn't think, that it's a terribly effective deterrent.
It's not. In America, where they do have the death penalty, they have a much higher rate of murder than Canada, where they don't have the death penalty. And that's even allowing for the difference in population.
I've often thought if you're putting people in a big building, sort of a university of crime, if you like, for years and years and years at great public expense, if you could come up with an invention, a time machine, and the judge sentences this person to 10 years and they put the terminals on him and age him 10 years. Much cheaper Job done. There you go. I don't know. But it seems like such a primitive thing to lock people up.
Just for the sake of locking them up.
Yeah.
I don't think it acts as a deterrent either. Increasing the sentence doesn't deter people. If it did, we'd have empty prisons.
Mm. So it doesn't work, but we go on persevering with something that is a failed arrangement.
You know, in Denmark for a while, and I don't know if they still do it, they had a system where prisoners worked and they were paid if they worked in a factory in the prison grounds or whatever, and they were paid, a reasonable sort of wage. Mm. They didn't keep the wage. That went back to look after their families so that the families weren't a drain on the social system. Mm. And I think that was a good system. Mm. I can see some merit in that.
I was going to ask you if you thought there was some country in the world that actually did it better than we do it, or somebody with an example of just how to do it.
I think some thought could be given to that. Prisoners who move to the pre-release centre can go out and work during the day, and they then pay board. And, I think that's something that could be encouraged because not only is it less of a drain on the public purse, but it teaches them to budget, it teaches them financial responsibility. Yeah. I think we could do a little more than we do. But I think the vocational training is one of the major improvements that I've seen over the years.
What do you think of the effectiveness or the desirability of having people out, but with a monitor, a leg bracelet or something?
Bracelet.
Yeah. Tracking device.
We use that. It's quite helpful if someone's a domestic violence offender and you don't want him going near the victim, because you can monitor where he is and you know where the victim is. Sometimes it's useful if people are known drug users, because SAPOL know the drug dealer areas.
Yes.
So if they are seen to be going to a particular residence on a regular basis, the red flags would go up. Yeah. So it can be quite useful, but of course they do cut them off.
Yeah, I've heard that. If you have as they call it, progressive government, they like to bring in things like safe injecting rooms like they have in Victoria, for example. Now, I've never understood how people can't join the dots. Drugs at every level, from the personal consumption to the purchasing, to the sale of, to the long-term effects of. Very hard to think of anything that is good about drugs, yet the state will put up something as contradictory in name as a safe injecting room. It can't be safe.
And it's not safe for the people who live around that area, I suspect.
Wouldn't think so, no.
But the main drug that's the problem now is methamphetamine. We hardly ever see any heroin.
Yeah.
Cannabis, of course, is a bit of a problem because there's the argument about medicinal cannabis.
Well, it's also a doorway, isn't it? Entry.
It's a progress step to a harder drug, of course it is. But methamphetamine is rife in the community, and we're also starting to see cocaine.
Yeah, well, cocaine is sort of dresses itself up, I guess, as a glamour drug. I've never seen anybody do it. I've never done it myself. Red wine is about the most serious thing I enjoy. But cocaine, they have cocaine parties and all sorts of things that glamorise the business of taking cocaine.
Yes, but I think it gives people a high, which is temporary.
But putting anything up your nose or in your lungs would strike me as being very, very foolish.
Certainly long-term methamphetamine use is disastrous. It affects the brain, people's teeth drop out, they have skin diseases, they become anorexic.
Gee.
It's a terrible drug, and it's everywhere.
And the kids or the people who are on it don't know this?
I think, from what they tell me, that you don't have to use it very often to become addicted. Oh. And once you're addicted, it's very difficult to escape.
Yes.
Mind you, a lot of people don't try very hard either.
Yeah.
But, in a sense, we live in a community where the media is always telling you have to be happy all the time.
Yeah.
And that just isn't real. Life isn't like that.
No. And people talk about, it isn't fair. Well, life isn't fair.
Life isn't fair, that's right. And life isn't one happy, rosy journey. People have disappointments, they have bereavements, and you just have to deal with them without snorting something up your nose or sticking a needle of illegal drugs into your body.
And trying to give kids some sort of guidance as to what they should be doing if they want to live a happy life. This current push by a lot of, again, progressive governments, this idea of pill testing. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is where they set themselves up, government authorised, I guess, and you enter the gig or the function or the rave or whatever it is, and you go up to the table and you give the person behind the table one of your pills, and he or she will test it and let you know if it is likely to kill you. Now, it's kind of state condoning of kids taking pills.
It's not just condoning, it's encouraging.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, but why can't a government, like the Victorian government, why can't they? And Canberra is the worst place, because this seems to be where they try out the most aggressively stupid things you could think of.
I can only think, Jeremy, that there is some sort of naive philosophy behind it, that they're going to do that anyway, so let's minimise the risk.
Yeah.
Now,
harm minimisation, they talk about.
Well, harm minimisation means zero tolerance.
Zero tolerance, I agree with you. Don't put pills in your mouth. Who would buy pills from, I guess, a pusher or a stranger and imagine that good could come out of that purchase?
And they don't even know necessarily what's in the pills.
No.
But if it's a pill and you swallow it, it will make you feel better. That's
society.
That's society. And, sometimes people just believe that, and it becomes a pattern of behaviour. If Granny dies and you have to go to the funeral, then you have to take something.
Yes.
Well, we're all going to die. We're all going to have people die.
Yes.
It's not a reason to get off your face on methamphetamine.
No.
But I hear that all the time.
I'll bet you do. Do you ever get, not cynical, depressed?
Yes, sometimes I do. I get so discouraged.
Yeah.
It's the apathy that gets to me. When people just sit there and say, there's nothing I can do and I'm not getting enough help.
Yeah.
And they're probably surrounded by a whole lot of agencies who are happy to help. But there's no sort of feeling that they have to do anything themselves.
Yes.
And
take control.
The apathy and the apathetic approach to life, and the handballing of one's problems to everybody else.
And the sort of victimology of it. I'm a victim, I do.
That's very common. Yeah. So that does really frustrate me at times.
Well, don't be frustrated. That's wonderful to see. I love having you in my dining room talking about your fantastically interesting life.
Oh, it's always good to have a stimulating conversation with you, Jim.
Wonderful to see you again.
Thank you.
Frances Nelson, KC.